global Christianity really came to life through the work of Phil Jenkins back at the beginning of the 21st century. But it's taken on a whole new life. But very little has been done on urban global Christianity. So I set out to find out, what are the factors that contribute to this robust and the tenacity of Christians in the city? And so that helped me to develop my thesis, which was very much about what is the place of Christian faith in the city of Montreal in the secular age. But this is what I think is so important in the secular age, that if Christians want to live their faith in the secular age, you better be patient. It's just going to take a lot longer. Right. Because the conditions of believability have irrevocably changed. Right. And so therefore, we adjust to that. Telescope ahead, 2024. The union goes on strike, which gives the government all sorts of opportunities to rewrite job descriptions and the whole bit. And that service, which I just described 20 years ago, is now defined this way. The animator offers students opportunities to open up to diversity, particularly cultural, physical, and sexual diversity, in order to value and foster a school climate of caring and well-being.
All imminent.
Totally imminent. Totally here and now. With absolutely no reference to the transcendent.
Right.
Okay?
Right.
And Christians say, how do I live my faith?
Well, we're really pleased to have Dr. Glenn Smith from Presbyterian College at McGill here with us. Longtime friend and colleague. Glenn and you and I have crossed paths in many, many contexts over the last number of years. Yeah, right. It's been a real pleasure getting to know you in the last little while, but we're here really to take a closer look at a monumental book that you've just recently published. It's called Christianity in the City of Montreal. And so we want to take a little bit of time and unpack some of the insights that you found and wrote about in this book. But before we get started, it's probably be just good for our audience to hear a little bit about yourself and give yourself a little bit of a self-intro.
Oh, let's keep that brief. It's a delight to be with you, David. Always fun to come and visit the Evangelical Fellowship of Canada offices. I grew up in the city of Toronto, and probably the most important part of that sentence is that I've been a city lover and liver all of my life. So to come to this book is only to take me into what I enjoy. My wife and I have been living and working out of Montreal since 1976. We moved there in 1980.
Expo year.
Olympic year.
Olympic year, right. Yeah, 67 was Expo, right?
Yeah. Although I was at Expo 67 when I was a teenager. But we've lived in Montreal since 1980. And I was doing university chaplaincy work when I was finishing both my master's and my doctorate. And so from 1983 to 2018, I was the executive director for a small Quebec-based community development organization called Christian Direction. I left that 7 years ago, and I've always been involved in theological education, but we started a dedicated master's program in practical theology at Presbyterian College in French, and so that's where I spend my time. But my 3 daughters and my 3 sons-in-law, my 2 granddaughters live in Montreal, so Montreal is home.
Montreal's home.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, Glenn, this book, I had the opportunity to read a pre-publication version of this book. And, I've known you for quite some time. And you're just like, you're a friend. You're a good friend and brother. But when I read this book, I was just blown away by the depths of insights here and a whole new respect for what you do. Really what I think you would like to be called typically as an urban missiologist. And so interestingly, this is a book about the city of Montreal, Christianity in the city of Montreal. So even before we dive into it, I sensed as I was reading, this is a long time project. This took a long time, even the way your footnotes are and the data that you're drawing on from such wide, this took a little bit of time. Tell me a little bit about how you went about writing this book, because I think it was more than you too. I think there was all kinds of people that were involved in this. Tell us a little bit about it. It's an unusual book, I'm saying.
Well, you're very kind. This book is part of a series by Bloomsbury Academic on what we call urban global Christianity. When you're talking about global Christianity, you're talking about what the wonderful Scottish missiologist Andrew Walls refers to the indigenous principle and the pilgrim principle.
Okay.
That Christians have a social imaginary. They live in their context. They're indigenous to that area, to that city. But we're pilgrim people. We're followers of Jesus, and so there's a universal implication. Global Christianity really came to life through the work of Phil Jenkins back at the beginning of the 21st century. But it's taken on a whole new life. But very little has been done on urban global Christianity. So the publisher has mandated 25 of us to write a book on 25 of the large cities of the world. So this is the only Canadian city in the series. It's the first of a quote-unquote Western developed city. So it was kind of a fun project to be involved in. Because, as I said, I'm an urban lover, I'm an urban liver, I've always tried to read the Bible through an urban lens. And my profs taught me about that. But I always teach my students that Christians and churches can be in the city. Most churches like to do things for the city, but the biblical posture is to be Christians with the city. So prepositions become important. So when I was contracted to do this book, because I'm an urban missiologist, as you said, I'm trained in what we call ethnography. So we're studying ethnic groups, and we're using qualitative methods to understand the life of people in their community. So the fun part of the book was to do some of the statistics, but I went onto the ground. And so I interviewed 50 people, semi-directed interviews, similar structure. And then I had my graduate students, I had 7 graduate students do work in different communities. That's a chapter. One of my daughters, Krista, who did her doctorate in the arts, contributed wonderfully to the chapter on Christians in the City of Montreal, but in the arts. And what we were trying to figure out is all the discourse about the decline and for some people, the desire to get rid of churches in Montreal. That didn't pass the smell test with me, because there is a strong sentiment in the city and in Quebec culture, a self-identity to Roman Catholicism. And that has stayed rather robust. And then I even saw in my Protestant traditions and in evangelical churches, the vibrancy of so many churches, including from the cultural communities. And then there were other structures about Christendom that they just didn't make sense to me anymore. So I set out to find out, what are the factors that contribute to this robust and the tenacity of Christians in the city? And so that helped me to develop my thesis, which was very much about what is the place of Christian faith in the City of Montreal in the secular age. Now, I realize we'll get to that in just a minute.
Yeah.
But, most of us were well educated in the secularization thesis, that as modernity comes along, faith gets privatized, it gets marginalized, and so therefore we're the imminent end of faith. And that just wasn't true. So I wanted to document what was going on. Now, people who read the book will see that I'm a very good friend. I love him dearly. And he was one of my chief contributors in our dialogue. But Charles Taylor would put it this way, the Canadian philosopher. He would say, if he put it this way, he didn't say it, I'm saying it, but in 1642, when those first 42 colonists came to Montreal, which was Tiatioke for in the Mohawk language, it was impossible not to believe. Those were Christians.
Right.
That was a missionary enterprise. That was 1642. Okay, telescope ahead, 375 years later. Publicly speaking, it is virtually impossible to believe.
Right.
So I'm interested in is what has happened to the conditions of believability. And my point is Christians are alive and well, smaller, but much more robust and incredibly tenacious. So that was kind of what I wanted to do.
This conversation is pretty good. The other thing I want to talk to you about today is subscribing to Faith Today magazine. For over 40 years, Faith Today has been dedicated to hosting Canada's Christian conversation on issues in our churches and society. One of the best ways to keep up with this ongoing, timely conversation among Canada's 4 million evangelical Christians is to get our free print magazines. Magazines are now free to mailing addresses within Canada. Learn more and subscribe now at faithtoday.ca. Let's get back to the conversation. So that's interesting, Glenn, because now I'm talking about experience. I've been to Montreal, many times over the past years, but I lived in Montreal for a couple of years while I was doing my PhD at McGill. And so that was in the early 2000s. And I can tell you, I'm from Western Canada. I remember when I first arrived in Montreal the very first time. It was probably the very first time that I'd ever been to Montreal. And I remember some of those preliminary perceptions that I had back 25 years ago. And as I was reading your book, I was thinking, I'm wondering if things have changed or not. So, for example, this is what happened. I remember very quickly, going to the McGill campus and seeing the big cross on the mountainside, the Mount Royal cross there, and seeing all of the churches everywhere, and seeing these huge cemeteries, Christian cemeteries, on the mountainside. And the symbolism, and even advertisements on the bulletin boards or in the billboards for church things and bishops and Catholic churches. And then on the other side, I would see like the sex shops and the strip clubs and the sexualized advertising and the entire kind of entertainment enterprise that sort of is the downtown core where McGill is. And I remember this strange juxtaposition of this, and asking the question, like, is this a Christian place or not? Right? Is it? And so as I was reading your book, I still felt that sort of what I think later on you're going to call cross pressures between these two. So when you talk about a robust Christianity in Quebec, even now 25 years later in the current era. Are we talking about robust in a what does that mean by when you say robust? Because from a percentage wise, now I was a bit surprised by that too. So talk to us a little bit about the demographics really quickly, but also what are you talking about when you say robust Christianity?
So are your perceptions going back to your doctoral years? Are they skewed? Let me answer by saying no, but. Okay. Let me help our listeners to visualize this. In Montreal, we have these wonderful triplexes with iron works to go up the stairway. And think about a triplex with a main floor, a ground floor, and an upper floor.
Right.
Okay.
Now, I lived in one of those triplexes, by the way.
Oh, good. So you've got it in your head. Yeah. Okay. Now let me apply that image to what I learned and what I was doing. On the main floor of the triplex in Montreal, when we're talking about the church and churches in Montreal, unquestionably, there has been a decline, and there is a lack of attendance on a weekly basis in places of Christian worship. Roman Catholic, Orthodox, mainline Protestant, evangelical. There's been a decline.
And when you say decline over how long?
60 years.
60 years.
60 years.
Right.
If you go back to 1960.
Right.
So you're on the main floor, and the empirical data is unquestionable. Okay. So then you go down to the main floor, and now you want to find out what are the reasons for that decline. Now, in my research, this was really fun. I remember interacting with Mohawk Christian brothers and sisters, and if you ask them about the present situation, they would say, once we took religion out of the schools, that's when the church started to decline. To which my comment to myself was, seriously? But so we're looking for reasons. Now, if you talk to Catholics for the reasons, they're going to say residential schools and clergy abuse. If you talk to English Protestants and English evangelicals, when the PQ got elected in 1976 and the English exodus, that was the reason. My point is that the reasons for the decline are important. When you get to the top floor, which is what I'm interested in, which is what is the place of Christian faith in the city in the secular age?
Right.
So if you think the decline is because we took religion out of the schools, you're not going to have much hope on the top floor until we get religion back in the schools.
Right.
Okay. If the problem is
the cause and the solution will be the same thing. The
flip side of the flip side. Yeah, flip side. Exactly. Yeah. So keep that in mind. Now, what did I learn? And that's why part 3 of the book is the most important part, I think, in the book, because I'm trying to present what actually is going on. Okay. Here's what we see, and there's some really, and so we use some empirical data here, right. But I'll get to the ethnographic stuff and the dialogue. For example, Montreal is Mohawk territory as part of the Iroquois nation. There are 112,000 Mohawks in the census metropolitan area of Montreal. What's interesting is only 290 of those people self-identify with an Aboriginal spirituality. 56% identify as either Roman Catholic or Protestant. So you don't have a whole lot of marginalization going on in the Indigenous communities in Montreal. Now, on the Roman Catholic side, what's interesting is that 44% of Montrealers, 4.3 million people, still self-identify as Roman Catholic. Now, that's huge.
That's really huge.
That's really huge. That's really huge. But now, so then we went on the ground because that's just self-identification, okay? It's worth what it's worth. What we did is we did actual head counts with priests in the 301 Roman Catholic parishes in Montreal. That's 3 dioceses. And what we found is that there were 3.6% of those 1.8 million Montrealers who self-identify as Roman Catholic who actually practice their faith. Not just go to church once a month, but they practice their faith. They read their Bibles. They're involved in community work. They go to Mass in their senior citizens' homes. So 3.6%. When I met with the bishops in those dioceses, they thanked me for the number. They said, we thought it was about 2%.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Okay. So there's a message of hope here.
So from their perspective, this is really robust.
This is really robust. Okay.
Right.
Now, come to the Protestant side, and this is where the decline has been most evident because of the English exodus. But there are still 187,000 Montrealers who self-identify as Protestant and evangelical, which is 4% of the population. But when you get below self-identify and you find out how many people practice their faith, it's closer to 30% of the population. And this is really interesting.
30% of the Protestant population.
Okay.
Yeah.
And now we know that there are 538 Protestant and evangelical churches in the census metropolitan area. So that's significant. Mm-hmm. But here's what's really interesting. There has been a real move in the culture where now 326,000 Montrealers, a full 9%, 8% of the population, self-identify uniquely as Christian. They don't say I'm Roman Catholic. They don't say I'm Baptist. They don't say I'm Pentecostal. They say I'm a Christian. So now you got to...
So you're saying 9%.
Yeah. So then you got to dig into the data. And you go into what we call the National Household Survey. And what you will find out is that 43% of those people practice their faith like evangelicals practice their faith.
Interesting.
But they don't want the evangelical title. They don't want the Baptist title. They don't want the Wesleyan title. They don't want the Salvation Army title. They want just Christian. And that is happening as well with their churches. The title of their churches is changing. Now then, there's been the great migration from Eastern Europe. And so that's the growth of the Orthodox churches. Romanian, Greek, Russian, and there's 135,000 Orthodox in Montreal, but it's primarily in the ethnic communities. And so that's why in the chapter I do on Christians in the cultural communities, I deal with the Orthodox. And there's a real vibrant growth of those congregations. There's 45 Orthodox congregations in Montreal.
So you're talking about where there's growing Christianity in Montreal tends to be still dominated by the ethnic groups, by immigrant, more recent ethnic.
No, I wouldn't say dominant.
Okay.
It's a lie because it still represents only about 18% of the population.
I'm talking about the growth, though.
Yeah, the growth.
Where it's growing.
Yeah, where it's growing, but these congregations are incredibly multicultural. So, for example, there's a very, very strong Haitian presence in Montreal because of immigration, French-speaking immigration. But we're into 3 generations now. So it's a little hard to know because Haitians who are here for more than 2 generations, they don't identify as Haitians. They identify as Quebecers, right. And rightfully so. So it's a little hard to know. But here's what we're finding. I document that there are about 156,000 people that go to church each Sunday in Montreal in Roman Catholic, Protestant, Evangelical, and Orthodox churches. And those are the people who are practicing their faith. These are the people that are volunteering. These are the people that are giving money to causes. These are the people that are praying. These are the people that are involved in small groups. So the decline, unquestionable. But robust, these are the people that are taking their faith seriously. So the bottom line for me is nominalism has been buried in Montreal, and to which I say, good riddance.
You better define that for us, just to make sure that everyone understands what you're saying when you say nominalism.
Nominalism being people who simply for the purposes of Statistics Canada self-identify as Baptist, Pentecostal, Roman Catholic,
Orthodox. Yep.
Okay, whatever.
Okay, now repeat your statement.
So that huge number of people who self-identify for Statistics Canada with their denominational label, but don't practice their faith, those are not the people that are going to church anymore. And so what we've tried to do in the study is to get beyond self-identity and to look at how people are practicing. And that gets us into the social imaginary.
Right.
And that's where real life is. So that's where the hope is in my opinion.
Slight tangent, but I think pretty important, especially for even some of the work that we're doing at the EFC in terms of religious attitudes, religious practices, and so on. Because it's always a question of yes, there's self-identification, but then there's the actual practices, right? And it seems to me that you're saying that attendance at church is still one of the dominant major confident markers that we can look at. Because you're saying church attendance does seem to align with practicing of the faith.
Yeah, it's
not the only thing.
It's not the only one, but it's an important marker.
Right.
What I did find is small groups in Roman Catholic parishes, particularly in evangelical congregations. There's churches in Montreal. They have more people in their small groups than they have coming on Sunday morning. Yeah, right. So it's a marker, an important marker, but not the only marker.
Right.
Because we want to know what people are doing in putting their faith into practice.
Yeah.
Okay. So that's it. So that's what we're on. And that's the social imaginary.
So that really leads into really kind of the core or heart or essence of your work, where you're asking the question of how do we live out that practice? How do we practice that faith in a city like Montreal, which has this tension, this being known for a place that's freed itself from religion, even though all of the other signs seem to indicate it's still there. So I wasn't surprised, Glenn, having known you for a number of years already, that you had a significant conversation partner with the philosopher Charles Taylor.
Yeah.
And you use a bunch of the concepts. I've spoken of Taylor's concepts before as well. But I think it's really good for us to identify. I'm going to identify 3 for you.
Okay.
Because there's several that Taylor actually uses, but you've engaged in conversation on these 3 topics. The secular, what does that mean?
Yeah.
the social imaginary. You've already used that term a couple of times. And I think we need to unpack a little bit what that is. And then coming out of those, the cross pressures.
Yeah.
And so let's just take a few minutes and unpack each one of those.
Yeah.
Of course, secular.
Okay. Yes.
Secular is one of those words that we all throw around and everybody uses it. Yeah. But when you're using secular as Charles Taylor has used it, to give us a little bit of a sense of as quick as possible.
Yeah, okay, let's do it. Yeah, it's really not that complicated because you can use the word secular and then use the noun secularism, which in normal usage means that in the public sphere, everything is about what is of this world.
Right.
So therefore, religion, faith is not part of that domain. And that's not what we're talking about in this conversation. Right. Then there is secularization, which with the TION is that process. And that's where the trouble becomes, because there are so many definitions of that. It's impossible to have any idea where the author or the person. So you'll hear this all the time. Oh, the decline in the church is because of secularization. Well, now, come on. Right. Okay. But I'm not talking about that.
And that includes secularization theories.
Theories and the paradigm in particular. What I was more interested in is what Taylor calls secularity. Mm-hmm. And let me go back to my illustration. In 1642, when the colonists came to Montreal, it was impossible not to believe. Those were committed Christians. They were part of the Roman Catholic renewal in France, coming out of the Council of Trent, the Protestant Reformation. These were lay people. But believe it or not, 42 colonists, there was only one priest. They were all lay leaders. They'd all signed on to the two founding documents. This was a missionary enterprise. The bishop at the time didn't want them to come to the island of Montreal. He wanted them to go to Ile d'Orléans near Quebec City. They were convinced that God had called them to go to the island of Montreal. They'd read Jacques Cartier, they'd read Samuel de Champlain. They were coming to Montreal. It was impossible not to believe. Okay, telescope ahead to 2025. Publicly speaking, it's impossible to believe publicly. The conditions of belief have irrevocably changed. So when I'm using the word secular, I'm saying secularity. And to probably put that in the clearest terms, we live in the immanent frame. We can live our lives disconnected from the transcendent, disconnected from the God of Jesus, disconnected from the Bible, and we can actually slough it off. Now, Taylor has lots of technical terms. My term for this immanent frame is that we're captured by hyper-individuality. We all live in that frame. We all live in that world. That's where we are. Now, that then leads to the second thing you asked me. Okay, what is a social imaginary? Now, many of us who would be watching today or listening would be familiar with the idea of a worldview. Mm-hmm. Now, a worldview is a very technical, philosophical thing. Taylor was very perceptive to say, no, I don't want to deal with theory. I want to actually deal with how people imagine their social situation. We're not talking about what just the elites, what philosophers, what social scientists. We're talking about how people in the community. So therefore,
it's almost what energizes the everyday person. It's
exactly.
what drives them forward.
Well, exactly. And so that's why I wanted to listen to the stories. I wanted to discern the symbols. I wanted to hear what people saw as their surroundings, how they saw life, what are their problems, what are their solutions, how are they living it out. And so I think the easiest way...
It's a very practical, It's a very practical orientation.
Well, exactly. Yep. And that's why Taylor puts it this way, that a social imaginary is the kind of collective understanding that gives a group a way to understand their practices. So therefore, if you study practices, do people read the Bible? Do people give? Are people generous? Do people do community service? Do people go to church? You look at what they do, and then you get an idea of how they imagine their social.
What animates that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
The fuel behind it.
Exactly. So the stories became important. So that's why I took my approach of doing interviews with people, walking neighborhoods, sitting in on church services, interacting with priests, interacting with pastors. We mobilized my graduate students. They studied those 7 neighborhoods that are found in chapter 9 of the book, because we wanted to get at how do people understand their practices? How do they imagine their social world? And I have found it a liberating way to understand, okay, what's going on the 3rd floor of the triplex? Because if I think the problem is secularization, or I think the problem is we took religion out of the schools, that's self. We're gonna always look at it dead.
Right.
But if we look at practices, all of a sudden that's where we see what's going on. Now, then you asked me the question.
But before we go to cross pressures, because I think probably at this point, give us a couple examples. I mean, there's dozens in the book, and you can't get to them all. But just give us 2 or 3 examples that really stood out, that illustrated this social imaginary kind of way.
My wife introduced me to this wonderful woman, and I tell her story because when you get into the secular age and you talk about how the conditions of believability, you would want to ask the question, why would anybody convert to follow Jesus in the secular age? And I met this woman, Violaine. She was a community development organizer with my wife. And Violaine told me her story. She grew up in a very nominal, non-practicing Roman Catholic home in the borough of Saint-Laurent. As she was becoming a teenager, she got interested in St. Francis of Assisi. So she had a little corner in her room where she would read Francis's writings. She was in the arts, she was in film, and she just got discouraged with life. And so she went on a trip for Canadian students doing service overseas. And she ran into a sister with the Congregation Notre Dame, which is a Roman Catholic religious order, women who are involved in educating people. She spent 4 years in a small group, listening to that sister, listening to other women. And then she told me the story about one day she decided she was going to commit her life to following Jesus. And then she became a sister with what we call the CND, the Congregation Notre Dame. Now, that religious order committed to educating young people is not cloistered. Those sisters live in the neighborhood. So that's how Sandy met her. David, I met scores of people that told me their stories of conversion. And I said, God, by his Spirit, is alive in the city. I better join him. And so this is what was so amazing to me. I go to a church.
To put it in the inverse, I'm a theologian. It wasn't someone came and said to her, this is who the triune God is. This is who Jesus is. This is the story of creation. No. It was being embedded within a community that believed that.
That's right.
But that wasn't the way in which she found her way.
No, that's right. And it took time. And this is what, we'll come to this in a minute, but this is what I think is so important in the secular age, that if Christians want to live their faith in the secular age, you better be patient. It's just going to take a lot longer.
Right.
Because the conditions of believability have irrevocably changed.
Right.
And so therefore we adjust to that. I think the other thing I found was how many congregations are actively involved in some of the most down-to-earth social service projects. But they don't say that it's evangelism or social service or evangelism. They put it all together. And they just say, this is what a follower of Jesus does.
Right.
And I saw stories of that everywhere. I was actually moved as I thought, this is unbelievable. God is at work. And so this is why I'm very hopeful. Yeah.
So we've got the secular, which kind of seems like the conditions, and then we've got the social imaginary, which is the animating side. But now we've got these cross pressures.
Cross pressures,
Now, talk about that, because I think this is the tensions that I think we feel, right?
Yeah. So cross pressures is all about this, is that we've got this connection with the transcendent through Jesus Christ by the power of the Spirit in our lives. We read our Bibles, but we live in the eminent frame. And the eminent frame, this absence of the transcendent, clashes with who we are.
Right.
And so what do? Now, let me come to the solution in a minute. But here's some of the cross pressures that I identified. And I heard this a lot in my interviews. David, back at the beginning of the 2000s, the organization that I was leading, Christian Direction, we were under contract with the Ministry of Education to place evangelical chaplains in schools all over Quebec to do what was called religious animation. They would be teaching the moral and religious curriculum in schools. They were providing chaplaincy services. We did that for 10 years. It was incredible. We were in almost all of the Protestant schools in Quebec. Telescope ahead, 2024. The union goes on strike, which gives the government all sorts of opportunities to rewrite job descriptions and the whole bit. And that service, which I just described 20 years ago, is now defined this way. The animator offers students opportunities to open up to diversity, particularly cultural, physical, and sexual diversity, in order to value and foster a school climate of caring and well-being.
All imminent.
Totally eminent, totally here and now, with absolutely no reference to the transcendent.
Right.
Okay?
Right.
And Christians say, how do I live my faith?
And that's now where we're expected to live.
Right. Okay, that's a cross pressure. Another cross pressure. The Pope comes to Canada on his pilgrimage asking for forgiveness for the residential schools. He comes to Quebec. Obviously, he would come to Quebec because of the shrine to St. Anne, just outside of Quebec City. I was frankly flabbergasted by the number of Quebecers, journalists, the political elites, the normal person on the street who was saying, the Pope should never come to Quebec. Why is he coming to Quebec? And I would actually hear people saying to me, just let Native peoples go back to their native spirituality. And I remember talking with one of my Mohawk friends. He said to me, when he heard that story, he said, there they go again, you white people telling us how to believe. He called it reverse colonialization. But it was a cross pressure. Right. It really shows up in Quebec with what we call Bill 21.
Right.
Which is about the removal of all religious symbolism from people who work in a public function, and it's banning all of that. It's a huge pressure. Initially, had a lot of support until a Muslim teacher right across the river from here in Gatineau, Muslim who wore the hijab, lost her job, and then all of a sudden, people were saying, "Oh, well, we didn't think it was going to affect individuals." To which I said, what did you think it was going to affect? Doorposts? But it's a cross pressure.
Yeah.
Unquestionably, the largest cross pressure in Quebec started on the 6th of December, 1989, when that young man went into Polytechnique and murdered 14 women. Mm-hmm. And the violence against women, it's alive and well to this very day. But who gets blamed for it? The church. Because of how women are perceived in the church. But I think the saddest part to me in the cross pressures was when I interacted with bishops and vicar generals, and they would talk to me about the church in Quebec, and they would say the residential schools and clergy abuse was horrible. But they would say to me, but that wasn't the worst. The worst was we tried to cover up. And so now anything that goes wrong in the culture gets blamed on that.
The cover-up.
Yeah.
As if it's a cover-up.
Yeah.
Right.
And so therefore, Christians then see this shift in schools, the shift with laws. They see what the church has done wrong. They see the harm that was done to children. And they see these attacks coming. They want to live their life. They want to live their faith. But what do we do with this eminent frame? And the vast majority of Christians, what do? They muzzle themselves.
Right.
They go quiet. And they say, well, I've got my own relationship with Jesus. I'll practice my faith. I'll go to church. I'll serve. But I'm not going to say anything. But I say, no. That's the eminent frame. That's what the culture wants you to do. And I think we as evangelicals have a real struggle here because we have this little jingle line we use about having a personal relationship with God through Jesus Christ. Now, I get it. I understand it. I've even used it. But how do people in the secular age understand that?
They understand that as privatization.
Privatization.
Right.
I can follow Jesus in my heart, in my head. And so we've just...
And not at church either.
And not at church either. And so then what do? You go back into the very secularity of the culture.
Right.
And I think that's the big challenge.
The other thing I want to bring to your attention is that the Faith Today podcast is published by the Evangelical Fellowship of Canada. Are you receiving the EFC's Canada Watch newsletter? It brings you the latest updates on Canadian public policy changes, EFC ministry activities, partnerships, and research projects. Join thousands of other Canadian Christians getting Canada Watch by mail or email. Visit evangelicalfellowship.ca to sign up today. That's evangelicalfellowship.ca. Now let's get back to the conversation.
This is such a great segue because where are you seeing evangelicals in Quebec, for example, who are figuring out how to do this, how to live within this cross-pressure? Because I think we've tended to think, those of us outside of Quebec, have tended to think about Quebec, Montreal, as kind of leading edge secularism in Canada. It's the most secular place in Canada. We often kind of talk about it that way. And yet you're seeing this vibrant, robust Christianity in all kinds of streams of streams of Christianity. But obviously you're also seeing some unique ways in which evangelical Christians, we're the Evangelical Fellowship of Canada, are actually doing this. And maybe you could share like what are a couple of those examples, and then immediately we'll talk about what does that mean for the rest of us.
Well, what I always like to tell people in the rest of Canada is we're not that far ahead of you. Because we all live in the eminent frame.
Of course, right.
Hyper-individuality is alive and well in Red Deer, Alberta.
Right.
Okay, because it's in the water system, if I can use that metaphor. Here's what I find. I find that there is more collaboration in boroughs and in neighborhoods between Christians of all confessional affiliations than I've ever seen in my life. We are in a new ecumenism. Now, I understand in our evangelical tradition, we don't like that word. I always like to point out that the first people to use the word ecumenism were evangelicals in France and in Switzerland. They wanted to get together and work together.
Right.
So we're going to come to the table together. But I understand our hesitancies. So I like to say it's a robust fellowship. But I'm seeing churches doing things together in communities like never before. One of my grad students, his really, really great church in Montreal, but it's always had a funny relationship with its borough. And Benjamin is now taking his church through a whole process of getting to know borough officials, getting to know civil servants in the community, about providing services for schools. Now, none of that is radical, but it's engagement, and it's engagement with the community. And I see that going on everywhere. Now, what I really find interesting is what particularly churches with an evangelical faith and practice are doing is faith education with children.
Interesting.
I have one. I document one church in my in the book. They have over 800 kids in their Sunday school. They have over 300 young adults in their Friday programs. I saw two English churches that are doing a marvelous work through church education. In other words, taking religion out of the schools was not a bad thing. Because it helped us as Christians to realize the first educators of our children in faith issues is in the home and in the church.
Right.
We shouldn't be delegating that to the public school system.
Right. Yeah.
So I see stuff like that going on. So those were, I just found all sorts of good stories. The chapter that my daughter first wrote, and then we did the final edits together on arts. I mean, it would have been incredulous for me to publish a book about Montreal that didn't include the arts.
Right.
And so Krista was just great in helping me to pull that off. But Christians who are artists, and they are using their art to express their vocation of being followers of Jesus and impacting the arts community. It's wonderful stories.
And just as a little addition to that, it's not even necessarily, I think, some type of overt artistic representation of the faith. It's being an artist, a follower of Jesus, and being an artist, doing your work in the community of artists. It's not necessarily having always Christian. That might include some Christian themes or Christian motifs in your art, but that's not what you're talking about, right?
Yeah, we're talking about vocation.
Vocation,
and
right.
that, I think, is really, really important. That in the secular age, your vocation becomes an incredibly important avenue to follow Jesus and to serve Jesus and to serve the city. So I'm.
What are the quick? And we're going to have to wrap up here pretty quickly, Glenn. But what are maybe some of the quick cautions? Like, what are the lessons that have maybe Montrealers have learned? Some of the Christians that they're learning that we need to hear and learn from them from the rest of Canada.
Yeah. You fed me that question. Here's my biggest takeaway, and it's been something I've been working on for years, but it really hit me when I came to the end of the book. As culture moves to the eminent frame, that creates these crazy cross pressures for whatever reasons, the tendency of the church, historically speaking, is to go the other way. And so we kind of create a parallel culture.
Right.
In Christendom...
Are you talking about ghettoization of the churches?
Well, in Christendom, you could do that. But that's over. We live in the secular age. I always like to say to churches, don't react. Move to the middle. Affirm our historic, orthodox, evangelical faith. Affirm our belief that Jesus is Lord. We listen to the Spirit in the text, and then we engage in the community. So don't react to the culture. Engage the culture. Now, sometimes we engage the culture by saying no.
Right.
Sometimes we say to the culture, yes.
Right.
And that's where we have to have discernment. Okay, so
it's not engagement if it's always no, and it's not engagement if it's always yes.
Exactly, and that's where you need discernment. So that's where I came up with this little term that I developed with my friend Don Postursky, who passed away 7 years ago. We talked about principled pluralism. So we as Christians need to know, what are our core principles? Who are we? We are not afraid to say, this is what we believe, this is who we are, but we're going to practice pluralism by respecting you and by listening to you. Now, if you decide not to reciprocate, that's all right, because we're animated by the love of God. So we love regardless. But there will be that going back and forth. I'm also more and more convinced that I think Christians are going to be known in the secular age for a vibrant spirituality. That they will be alive and animated by the Spirit of God, and they will be listening, and they will be serving, they will be hospitable. I meet churches all the time that are pouring thousands of dollars into helping people in need in their communities. In other words, that's the Jesus way. So I see stuff like that going on, and I say, that's what makes the church right now robust and tenacious.
Christianity in the City of Montreal. Glenn, where can listeners pick one up?
There's two ways to do it in Canada, seeing this came out from a British publisher. The distributor of this book is called Login Canada, Login. So if you just put that into your search engine, it'll pop up and you can order it directly from them. Otherwise, Indigo has got it on their website, both in an ebook as well as getting the print copy. So you can; those are two places. But I'm sure Christian distributors are going to start picking it up as well. But there's two places to go.
So thanks, Glenn, for taking the time. We're looking forward to the next book. Is it going to be on Ottawa or Toronto or Vancouver? We'll see.
I'd be willing to help somebody, but it's not going to come from my computer.
That's right. So thank you for taking the time, Glenn. It's so I so enjoyed the book and was challenged by the book and has caused all kinds of thinking. I got to read it again. And I hope that our listeners will be ready to buy into the book and learn some lessons about what it means to do, I think at one point called exegesis of your context. And so there's the book right there.
Yeah.
Christianity in the City of Montreal, published 2025. So thanks, Glenn. God bless you as you continue your work in teaching, educating, and exegeting the city for the glory of God.
Thank you, David. Great to be with you.
Thanks.
Okay.